And we come to the part of the evening we've all been waiting for in anticipation, our guest speaker. So Douglas Kruger has 25 years of experience, a certified speaking professional designation, a spot in the Hall of Fame. We are rubbing shoulders with famous people tonight. He is a true expert. He's the best-selling author of Own Your Industry, Poverty Proof, and his new book, which I absolutely love the title, Wicked Smart, Brilliant Ways to Do Just About Everything Better. This book is coming to a bookshop near you soon. Please give the warmest Zoom welcome to Douglas Kruger.
Fantastic. Good evening, folks. Don't you love it when you find poetry in unexpected places? My phrase for the evening, and I've written it down here, is calibrated authenticity. I love that. That is absolutely delicious. My second favorite phrase for the evening is just be lekker to work with. I have to tell you, there are two things about this evening that are wonderful for me. The first is speaking with a group of professional speakers, which entails just letting your hair down and being able to chat about the things that matter to us, looking behind the curtain. And the second, and this is just, it's so nice, after 4 years in the Channel Islands, to hear South African accents. It's absolutely delicious. Very lekker, thank you. Folks, I've been in the Channel Islands, living in Jersey for the past 4 years. And if you happen to look it up on a map, you may need to squint a little. It is tiny. It's in the Channel Islands between England and France, and it is criminally close to France, although it actually falls technically under the UK crown. Now, don't tell people here that it is British or part of the UK. You will start a war. Because you see, 1,000 years ago, they decided that the distinction was as follows. Because William the Conqueror passed through, and on his way to conquering England, he was supported by the people of Jersey. Then he wrote back to them and said, what do you want to be part of, my France or my England? And they said, we'd like to be part of the British Empire, please. So for the past 1,000 years, they've been part of Britain under the crown, but not under the UK government. They have their own parliament. It's also, for what it's worth, the sunniest part of the British Isles, which I've discovered is a little bit like saying the least soggy part of a wet gym sock. The weather is most decidedly not South African, but it is an incredibly beautiful place to be. And a whole different market, and of course, access to a nearby speaking market with France visible from my son's school. And speaking about the changing accents, over the past couple of years, my son's accent has changed dramatically. He used to refer to his mother as mom or mommy. Somewhere down the line, he graduated her to mum. And I was a little troubled when ya became yeah, but we've stopped him short of saying things like, I got a bottle of water. We're like, no, that one's not going to happen. You put those T's back where they're supposed to be. So tonight we are speaking about some of the things that top-level speakers do that is a little different, something that you can add to your process. And I've tried to make this as practical for you as humanly possible, and I've created a checklist for you. Some 8 or 9, perhaps 9 or 10, we'll see how we go, questions that you can pose for yourself prior to any presentation. And these are simple little techniques that gain you a great deal of leverage. I've looked for as much of the Pareto principles here as I can. Small things that you can do that make the world of difference. And the first one is as simple as this. Is your first story sufficiently amazing? Folks, as you sit and think about your keynote, the talk that you deliver on a regular basis, think about the first story that you deliver. One of the mistakes we tend to make, and I've done this myself, is we try to build to what we think is our story with the greatest impact. Now, as members of the PSA, you know that our acronym, PSA, Point Story Application, is really at the heart and soul of what we do as speakers. We get up onto a stage and we tell stories that make points come alive. We try to gather the latest thinking, to cast our imaginations across the horizon and bring together everything of value to our audiences. But that's not enough. It's not about the dry data. Daniel Kahneman has long since taught us that the human mind doesn't think in dry statistics, dots and dashes and numbers and charts and graphs. We're able to process them. We can comprehend them. But the part of the mind associated with persuasion really likes to think in picture stories. And as members of the PSA, you've probably heard this before, that speaking in stories is your best asset and your most powerful approach. Now, the question then becomes, is your most powerful story front-loaded in your presentation? There is a great deal of research on which parts of an experience have the greatest impact. And essentially, there are three things that create the impression that lasts, the lasting impression of you. And it's very obvious. It's the beginning, your opening, it's the emotional peak, and it's the ending. Now, many of us try to start with a story that builds toward what we want to discuss as the main thing. I'd like to encourage you, in order to get repeat bookings in your industry, to front load your strongest story. That's going to have the greatest emotional impact, and it sets the tone for how the audience perceives you. A couple of weeks ago here, I had the chance to do something that I actually never got to do in South Africa, which was to speak at a TEDx event. And it made me nervous again after 25 years as a professional speaker. And I mean, it was like the palms were sweating and the trapezius muscles were up here. And it was a wonderful experience. But it takes you back to that whole idea, very much like a Toastmaster speech, of word-perfect delivery in a timed presentation. And I'm glad to say, with the support of everyone around and a great deal of practice, I think the presentation went well. One of the things they actually coached us to do is they said, in order to have the most impactful TED Talk you can, start with your strongest illustration, your strongest story. So in this particular case, I was speaking about the idea of strategic rule breaking. One of my books is titled, They're Your Rules, Break Them. And it's about how great leaders strategically dismantle the rules, regulation, bureaucracy that gets in people's way. And they free up human talent by doing so. And I had a bunch of corporate examples of that. I had examples from Tesla and SpaceX and the like. And I thought, what I want to do is open with as much global resonance, as much massive impact as I possibly can. So I started off by asking the audience a question. I posed this challenge. I said, imagine your task was to make an entire nation poor and then rich again without breaking any rules. How would you go about doing that? And I paused for a second and I allowed the audience to mull with that idea, and you hear that little faint susurrus around the crowd. And then I went straight into a story. I said, in the 1950s, New Zealand was in the top 3 globally for living standard. And then they made a fateful mistake. They started to add rules and regulation and bureaucracy to the point where they became one of the least free nations on earth. One economist described them as the least free nation that was not actually communist in name. And I told the story of an entire nation's plunge from some of the highest living standards in the world to among the lowest among developed nations. And then something interesting happened. A new government came in and took a hatchet to the rules, and almost overnight, they went right back up to the top 3 for living standards. And that story landed well because it had a massive sense of big things happening around the globe. Folks, what is your most impactful story? What is the thing that creates a sense of, here's something important? Try to front load your keynote presentation with that story. If you find that you're not getting booked as often as possible, the first place to go is to try to diagnose the beginning of the keynote. The exact same thing is true of authors. In addition to the business books, I do write a fair amount of fiction, and I end up interacting with fictional editors both in South Africa and now in the UK. And I've heard this advice from both of them. They say, don't tell the world this, but we've gotten to the point where we can pick up a manuscript and read the first paragraph, and we know if that book is going to sell or not. And what it comes down to is, do you get the audience, the listener, the reader, so engaged and so engrossed in a story that you can see the entire thing is going to fly? Is your first story powerful enough? Is it amazing enough? Now, you don't have to go the route of massive politics and trends around the world. You could tell something that fits into principle number 2, and that is, do you take them sufficiently far away? I found that a couple of my stories from South Africa work surprisingly well in the British and European speaking market. And I think the reason for that is the stories are so unusual for them. It's the sort of thing that doesn't happen in a high rules, high regulation society. And I'll give you a couple of examples of these. When I was growing up, I lived in Veltevreden Park, sort of west rand of Johannesburg, and we moved into the area when it was still being developed. And we ended up in a very strange scenario. We found that the families going to school around us were of a higher socioeconomic bracket than my family. We were struggling quite badly at the time. And I tell the story of my dad trying to entertain the kids. The other kids in our area were playing with things like Nintendo sets and quad bikes and all these expensive toys, and we simply didn't have the option. So my dad built this gigantic rope swing in our backyard. And what he did was he took a rock, put it into a sack, and literally hurled it over a branch that was some 30 feet high up in the air. And we used to hold onto handlebars at the end of this rope and run till our feet came out from under us, and then swing over the rooftop of the house on one side, turn around, touch down, run across the yard, and swing over the telephone wires on the other side. Now, in a society that is laden with health and safety rules, you would never get away with such a swing. They'd come and take your children away from you. And yet it's one of my best memories of youth. And the point that I make when telling that story is that the kids with the Nintendo sets and the quad bikes abandoned the expensive option to come and play on the rope swing. And I use that, I mean, you can see it as speakers. The setup there is to go into, it's not about the budget, it's about what's going on in your thinking. If you are thinking in clever, strategic ways, you can topple the giant, but you have to think laterally. Then I go into the how-to of doing that. But folks, in places like the British Isles, in places like Switzerland, they find themselves so overly regulated that a story like that transports them to the realms of imagination. And it just shows us that the stories that we develop and that we live through, that are just part of our culture in South Africa, have global resonance because they are so unusual. I'll give you an example of another one, and this is one of my favorites. Many, many years ago, at the start of my speaking career, I used to do late nights and early mornings presenting on Talk Radio 702. And we were talking about the weirdest entrepreneurs we've ever come across. And several people called in and told me the story about a guy who sold bunny chow outside of Soweto. And they said, if you pay him a little more, he'll take your bunny chow, stand on the edge of a highway, and hurl it in front of an oncoming truck. And I had several people actually call in and say, yeah, it's a true story. We've met this guy. And the whole point of this thing was he would then run out and retrieve your bunny chow from traffic. Again, talk about health and safety. The whole point was the theatricality of the thing. You would receive this bunny chow that's been run over by a truck. And it was such a strange and such an unusual story that I incorporated it into my talk on standing out as a brand and becoming unrivaled in an industry. And once again, it takes the audience so far away that it is utterly compelling. So, what is the first point you make in your keynote presentation? What's the first idea that you deliver, the first principle that you drive home? You have a bunch of people who are sitting in an auditorium. They've walked in there because, well, often they've been told to be there. The boss has said, you got to be there at a certain time, take your seats, the lights go down. They're thinking about dinner. And the worst thing we can do is keep them in that auditorium, mentally speaking. The best thing we can do is raise the theater of imagination so far that we take them universes away. And if you're doing this with a little bit of artfulness, you won't tell them what the point is first. You take them far away on this emotional, psychological journey. Leave them wondering, leave them waiting what the point is, then bring them catapulting all the way back to their seats. Could you do that in your next presentation? Folks, I hope what I'm handing out to you here are like little toys for a speaker, things you might play with and try out the next time you stand in front of a live audience. So number one, is your first story amazing enough? Number two, do you take them sufficiently far away before you bring them back to the point? That creates that sort of dream state where they feel as though they're living in their minds and they're seeing visual imagery. Now, staying with that theme, question number three. And this is a complex one. Can you make them the main character and show them postcards from the future? If you are taking it down, I'll say it again. We are being recorded, so you can review it if you'd like. Can you make them the main character and show them postcards from the future? So a simple example of this one. If I'm speaking about how to become the top expert or icon in an industry, say for a group of entrepreneurs, I start the presentation by saying, imagine yourself 3 years from today. You're walking off a stage very much like this one to thunderous applause. And as you step outside, your phone rings. It's a call from your publisher who wants to know if the book is ready. And by the way, are you free to appear on Talk Radio 702 tonight? As you get into your car and drive off, you think about what's changed in your life over the course of the past few years and how it was that you came to be here. And you realize that there were 5 things that you did that elevated you to an icon in your industry. Right, now what have I done? The first thing is I'm telling a story that never happened. This is a pure hypothetical. I have completely made it up. And it's a story about the audience. I've made them the main character of this journey. And if there is one thing that you cannot ignore from a seat in an auditorium, it's a story about yourself. So once again, think about the principles that you want to land with your audience. What might change if you made your audience members the main character in the story? If you told a hypothetical story in which you took them through that journey and invited them to see pictures from their own perspective, you hand them postcards from the future. Now, you can do this in the positive or you can do it in the negative. So, for example, you might tell a positive story that goes, it's 3 years from today, and you are the leading icon. You are the Clarkson of cars, the Elon of innovation, the Nigella Lawson of food. You are the top name in what you do. Or you could tell the same story in the negative. You could say, imagine yourself 3 years from today, and nothing has changed. You're still seated in the same cubicle next to the same person. Your salary has stayed the same, but your costs have risen. What happened in those 3 years? Or what failed to happen? Let's discuss what might happen in your future. Now, that's kind of the bleak and frightening version, but it shows you how you can get people emotionally arrested and invested in the stories that you tell. Make them the main character and speak in postcards from the future. The ways in which you can apply this are endless. Invite your audience to see picture stories as they play out, and especially to live through the consequences, both positive and negative, of those stories. Right, and this brings us to question number 4. And this was the core setup, the edifice underpinning our question for tonight. And the way that I phrased it is your voice strong enough? Which, of course, led us to the question, is it possible to be too polite as a speaker? Folks, let me pose an interesting challenge for you here. Why is Gordon Ramsay still on TV globally? The man gets onto the television and shouts at people for a good half hour. And he shouts at them quite eloquently and using quite imaginative language. And then at the end of it, the end credits roll, they pay him a great deal of money, and they say, please come back and do it again next week. Now, why is he able to get away with being effectively a sociopath? Well, the answer to that is twofold. 1, he knows his stuff. And 2, he fundamentally cares about the outcomes. So if you get up on a stage and you are simply a psychopath, a sociopath, you're swearing at your audience, you're rude to people, you will have no future in this industry. But Gordon Ramsay is not that. He's something different. He is someone who is so deeply and passionately invested in what he does that he just hasn't got time to beat around the bush. How might that look in our industry? Right, I'd like to give you homework. Jump onto YouTube and I'd like you to look up a man by the name of Alan Weiss. You've possibly come across him before. He is presented for the PSA. Alan Weiss lives in the United States, and his, shall we say, his brand is $1 Million. It's the $1 Million speaker, the $1 Million coach, the $1 Million consultant. All of his books are excellent, and I strongly recommend them. Try the audiobooks where you can, because you get them read in his voice. What I'd like you to look up in particular is Alan Weiss' presentation at Harvard. Alan Weiss' presentation at Harvard. And that will show you this exact balance that I'm referring to of not speaking too carefully because you know your stuff backward and forward. Alan Weiss speaks with a strong voice. There is nothing innocuous about him. There is nothing reserved about him, but it's because he stands for something and he cares. Now, as you go along there, dissect the presentation. Look for how he uses stories to make points come alive. Look for how he causes the audience to see his points from the perspective of the story. He makes his audience the main character. But more than anything else, ask yourself, how would that look if he had been too soft on the points that he makes? So I love the idea that we should be lacquer to work with. I'm setting that as a logo above my laptop. Always be lacquer to work with. I also think that we should remove as many barriers as we can to purchase. Be as easy and as smooth to work with as you can. Add value to the conference convener. Make sure that you help them to achieve both their overt and their behind the scenes, their psychological goals. Make them look good, help them in every way. This is not a call to be impolite, but it is a call not to be so soft-spoken with your ideas that you become an also-ran. If you study the landscape and look at the top speakers all around the world, these are strongly opinionated people. These are people with something to say, and they champion an identity, and they come across powerfully. Take a look at that video and see what you think. Number 5. Do you speak in questions? He asked. Do you speak in questions? If there's a simple thing you could do today on your slides, I would recommend doing this. Take a look at every headline you have and ask if you can turn it into a question. So it might be in a change from, say, you can out-innovate the competition to could you out-innovate the competition? Instead of what leaders do differently, you simply add the question mark at the end. What do top leaders do differently? There is a great deal of difference between a headline statement, which is like a resolution, a shutting down of thinking, versus a question, which is like a springboard. It's like the itch before the scratch. It is a launch pad that gets you going. And I'd like to ask you and encourage you to try and speak in questions as much as you possibly can. Now, of course, there are 2 kinds that you can use. Well, in fact, 3 if we count the slides. In your actual delivery, though, there are 2. You can use the hypothetical question where you say, have you ever felt this way? Have you ever been in this scenario? Or there are the actual questions. Who's been to Jersey? Have you seen this happen in your world? Who's witnessed this? And you ask for audience participation. Use them as much as you possibly can. Try this experiment the next time you're in a dull presentation. Try to notice when it is that people look back up again. So here's what you'll see. The heads start going down and they start playing with their phones and they're not paying attention. And the speaker will say something like, the other day I walked into a mall and everybody looks back up. What's happened there? Well, he started to tell a story, and that does something different to the minds of the listeners. Or he might say, have you ever been in this situation? And everybody looks back up again. Without fail, you'll find it's one of those 2 things. They've either started a story or asked a question. Now, I know you know this, but don't ever start a story with, I'd like to tell you a story. Just go straight in. In fact, a simple thing that we can do as speakers, and we can profit greatly from this, walk into the best-selling fiction section in your local bookstore and exclusive books, and just read the first paragraph of any of the best-selling fiction. Notice how quickly and elegantly they move into story. We can emulate that. We can study that. If it works, why wouldn't we learn the craft? So, do you speak in questions? Let's try a little experiment here. I am going to deliver part of a presentation, and I'd like you to count how many times I ask questions as I go along. Here's the setup. This is part of my speech essentially on innovative thinking, and it's titled, They're Your Rules, Break Them. And it's about looking at ways to disrupt the norm, get rid of regulations, get rid of bureaucracy, think against the grain. And the setup is this. I start by asking the audience, and I'll take it in from here. What's the worst problem you're facing right now? Whether it's at home with one of your family members, or perhaps in your finances, in your business, the thing that keeps you awake. At 2 a.m, you wake up and it churns in your stomach. What is that for you? Have you considered that someone, somewhere, has solved your problem brilliantly before? There was a hospital in the United States, and they had an unusual problem. Their mortality rates were off the charts. So they put together a quick panic study, and they tried to work out what was going wrong with their process. And they narrowed it down to a simple bottleneck. Here's what was happening. If you were in the ambulance en route to the hospital, you would receive excellent care. If you made it into the ER, the care was top-notch. Likelihood was you would be fine. But they discovered that there was a 3-minute handover period between these 2 teams. And during that handover period, there was ambiguity. No one was in charge. So if you were the leadership team, what would you do? Well, the first thing they did was they went and looked at the hospital next door, and they said, how do they solve this problem? And by studying their process, they got the handover period down to 2.5 minutes. Better, but not great. Then one young maverick had this crazy idea. And I wonder if this has ever happened to you. You have a thought that is so left field, so bizarre, that you raise your hand and you suggest it half as a serious suggestion and half as a joke. He said, you know, we should go and see how they service the Formula One cars at the Grand Prix. And you've seen this on TV, right? You watch the car, it comes in at Mach 4, skids to a halt, they change all 4 tires, feed the guy a pizza, give him a haircut, refuel the car, and off he goes in 0.2 of a second. And the leader spotted gold in the suggestion and said, what if we do? And they went and studied how this was done. And by copying and pasting the underlying principles, they got their own handover period down to 7 seconds. Not just industry leading, but life-saving. And so I'll ask you again, what is your problem right now, the worst one that you face? Have you considered that someone, somewhere, has solved it before? Now, folks, I'm going to ask you, and just answer this for yourself. Did you manage to count the number of questions there? I'm hoping that you lost track while I told the story, in which case it worked well. The point, though, is that questions engage, and they are so easy to add. Question number 6, and here we'll speed up a little just to make sure we do this in time. Have you mastered machine gun fire facts? All right, so we are theoretically deeply versed in what we do. We're able to go deep into the content and keep speaking for a very long time. How do you show that in a 60-minute keynote when you have to touch on something briefly? Because those quick displays of competence are incredibly important, but we have to actively signal our competence. Well, here's a way. I use, for example, Harvard Business Review quite often. I find that a lot of the kind of content that I talk on lines up with theirs, and they come out with great new fact studies and research every couple of months. And in fact, I would strongly recommend reading Harvard Business Review. As speakers, it is a very helpful publication. Right, pick up 3 or 4 facts from a Harvard Business Review that fit organically into what you're speaking about. Now, master their rapid-fire delivery. So this and this and this, and then you quickly move on into your story. And every now and then you pepper your keynote presentation with these rapid fire facts that are really just psychological cues to the audience that you know your stuff. It's one active way of displaying that in a keynote presentation that otherwise doesn't allow you to go into great depth. Question 7. Do you use A versus B to heighten emotion? All right, what is A versus B? Think of the idea, the principle at the heart of what you teach or what you present. That is the positive, what we will call the A. Now, what's its logical opposite? We will call that the negative, or B. So say, for example, you speak on wealth, how to generate wealth, how families can escape generational cycles of wealth. You speak on the positive creation of wealth. To make your message come alive, don't forget its antithesis, its opposite. Speak about poverty. Speak emotively about poverty. Learn 3 or 4 rapid-fire statistics about global poverty and local poverty. Learn 3 or 4 rapid-fire statistics about what causes it, what generates it, what holds people locked in these cycles of poverty. And for heaven's sake, bring some stories in as well. Don't just focus on the positive, remember the negative too. Why? Because it heightens the total emotional contrast between what you are teaching and what might happen otherwise. The cheesiest version of this you'll see on TV. You will never see an infomercial in which they go, buy our new vacuum cleaner, it cleans your household. Yeah, it always starts off with, is your household dirty, disgusting, and embarrassing? Are the neighbors fleeing from you en masse? Well, you need. And that's what they're doing. They're heightening the negative in order to accentuate the positive. Why do they do it? Because they've studied it and they know that it works. To be psychologically persuasive, add the A versus B. Don't just do the positive lesson, balance it, play it off against the negative. Question number 8. Are you a magnet for new content? So if you ever catch me walking down to gym, and here in Jersey, in St. Helier, you can pretty much walk anywhere. It's that small. I mean, you can kind of spit at France, and you probably should. I walk down to my local gym. And what I'm always doing is listening to audiobooks as I go. And I strongly recommend, if this is not a habit that you're into yet, please do get into it. I love Audible. I am always taking in new content. The last one I listened to was a brilliant book from the UK called The Diary of a CEO. And one of the wonderful tales there is about this young guy. He's 30 years old now. And in his early 20s, he landed his first client for a social media company and blew the money, putting a massive blue slide into his building. No steps for him. They were going to have a slide and a ball pit. Now, the net result of that was that first the BBC came to them for an interview, then ITV, then Channel 1, then Channel 4, then Fortune magazine, then Forbes. And he says he has never had a sales team and never actively marketed. And he is a multimillionaire in pound terms by his 30s. He attributes it in no small part to the blue slide. Now, folks, you know I'm going to steal that story because it's so good. When I speak about things like branding, positioning, or becoming iconic, I'm going to tell that tale. And I'm going to accredit it, and I'm going to say, go and listen to the book. And that story is going to become a part of making my message come alive. As you walk through the wilderness, as you walk down the journey of life, everywhere you go, you're going to hear stories, see things that, if you're tuned into them, will jump out at you as wonderful ideas for tales to tell. The weirder, the better. Take them as far away from those seats as you possibly can, then bring them back to the principle. Be a magnet for great stories and great ideas. And we'll stick with, say, just one more. Question number 9. Do you play with your audience? I immediately wrote down that phrase, that just be lacquer to work with. Because not only is it a delightful phrase, but it's also something that I can use to play with you. I love that phrase, and it's not in my presentation. It's something that is part of what's happening in this room between you and I, live in the moment. And the more you can do that, the better. Find ways to actively play with your audience. I love that the PSA spiked this session with the question, is it possible to be too polite? That added a whole dynamic to this entire thing. It was like, challenge Douglas with this. Do you agree? Don't you agree? Right, now let's get into it. And that added something very vital. I love it, and I'm going to steal it. So, in future, what I will do as a magnet for ideas is I'm going to try to spike things in advance that get an audience discussion going. Perhaps send it to them, perhaps put it up on the screen. I like having a question up on the screen when the audience walks in. Where will you be 2 years from now? What's the difference between you and the leading brand? I put something challenging up on the screen before the whole thing even begins, and it's playing toward exactly what you did this evening. Folks, it's been a joy joining you from the Channel Islands this evening, and I am 1 hour behind you. So it is 6:30 here, and it will be bright daylight until about 10 o'clock tonight.
Yeah.
Now, that's great in the summer. In the winter, however, by this stage, it will have been dark for about 3 hours. While I have sunlight, let us make hay, and I'd love to chat with you further. And once again, thank you so much for your time.
Fantastic. Speaking on behalf of everybody in the room, the question was, what world-class speakers do differently? And I think you've just demonstrated for us in the last 30 minutes. So amazing.